Okay, so this final theme that I'm discussing here looks at the concept of education through sport. Now, what I want to be clear on is that education through sport doesn't always have to be in PE lessons. A lot of the literature on education through sport actually sometimes is contextually more about projects and initiatives that use sport to try and encourage educational goals. A lot of it is rooted in the concept of Olympism, and we did focus on this idea of Olympic education in the lecture. So I think they're the best examples to look at and the best ones to discuss if you do. Um, I've not actually referenced her on here, but Thatu is one of the best people to look at in terms of Olympism and education. And I'll put up a couple of her papers on Sims Capital so you can have a look at that as well. Now, I think there's a few themes that you can look at if you decide to look at this one. The first is these different approaches to education through sport and how effective they are. If you look at the Dina Binder paper on there, she kind of goes through some of the different approaches and what they might look like. Then what you'd have to do is talk about how effective you think that approach is, back it up with some examples and some theory, and refer to how things like the media and the economy influence those. I know we briefly mentioned that some of the things which were supposed to be education through sport, educating the body through sport, things like Addy zones, if you like, were maybe just a resource. Or what happened in the build-up to the Olympics is there was lots of Olympic days and themes like that, but didn't always necessarily develop the long-term moral and physical development of people. So I think those are some of the ideas that you would kind of discuss here, and how the different approaches outlined in Binder and in the lecture could have been impacted by globalisation. And again, if you look on the Olympic website, there's lots of different examples of Olympic education projects. Now, the adoption of Olympic values into education, I guess, is the next thing that I'd look at. And can they be taught, or is information about the Olympics taught? So, what do we see in these Olympic education programs? Do they teach Olympism? Do they develop the morals and values which they are so closely sticking to, or which they are professing to do? Or do they actually just teach about the Olympics? Do they have an agenda? So, are they being taught because MasterCard wants to look good, or because BP needs to run a project, or something along those lines, as opposed to being taught for developing those values? And that's something that you can look at through a number of different ways. Now, the other thing that you can look at possibly inside of education is legacies, and where does this concept of Olympic legacy fit in with PE and sport, and to what extent has these Olympic education projects helped to improve it statistically? How many people participating in sport nowadays? Is it up since the Olympics? Has there been certain policies put in place as a result of global sports events to try and improve participation, try and educate people about using their body effectively, and how that will improve health, and how that improves these moral and educative purposes? Now, these examples can be in the UK, but they can be in other parts of the world as well. Again, if you go on the IOC website and you look at the education through sport projects, for example, I think there's one in Ukraine which was a quiz, but that's just a knowledge approach, and it's just teaching about the Olympics. It doesn't necessarily develop what Olympism says it should develop. So, with that in mind, I think there's some of the things that you could discuss. Now, I know this slide looks like maybe a little bit of a blank page, but for me, I think there's certain theorists that you can use, certain things that you can apply to it. John Dewey and his idea about education is not preparation for life, but education is life itself, is something that you could apply to some of these principles, and do they fit in for education purposes, or are they not really appropriate? One of the concepts that appears in one of the papers by Ramon Spash is he talks about Paulo Freire and Paulo Freire's ideas, and Freire talks about education and that it's more than just a banking of knowledge. Now, you could look at that, you could take that idea and you could use that to support negatively some of the approaches you look at. Olympism and the moral and values that are attached to the Olympics and Olympism is something that you could integrate. And also some of the stuff by people like Chris Grattan that talk about what makes a legacy, what makes an educative legacy, and so on, you could use and integrate as well. So they're just things that you could use in this setting to try and generate some good argument and to add depth to your argument, I would say. Don't let it drive your argument. Don't let it be about Dewey. Let it be about your argument, and then use Dewey to support what you're saying, or whatever theory you decide to use. Okay. Thank you very much. I hope that helps, and I hope to hear from you soon.